Okay, so obviously, welcome. And tomorrow we have your first English language paper, which is English language paper one, which is your reading and response to fiction. So I'm going to talk you through some general points, and then we're going to focus on questions 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this session should last for approximately an hour. Hopefully you've got your booklet that was handed out so that you can work alongside this video and make notes. If not, it is on Show My Homework and you can download it from there. So just a very quick reminder of timings. This is a 1 hour and 45-minute exam, and you should spend the first 10 minutes reading that text and making sure that you thoroughly understand it. Whilst reading it, don't be a passive reader, be an active reader. So you're actually going to need to do some things as you read that text. And the suggestions are that you have some questions going around in your mind as you do that reading. So, what are they telling me? How are they informing me? Why are they doing this? What language is being used? What structural technique? Just kind of having these questions so that you're engaging with the text. If you are a visual sort of like a visual person, you might want to create a little mind movie as you're reading through. So what can you see happening at each stage of this? You might be somebody who would rather just do a little bit of a doodle as you're reading through so that you understand what's looking at. Or if, like me, you like to work with words, then you might reduce the key events in each paragraph to maybe 3 words or 1 word. Now that's going to help you loads when it comes to both question 3 and question 4, because it means you've already got that familiarity with the text. So question 1, you want to spend no more than 5 minutes on this question. These are considered the easy marks by AQA. However, not everyone gets 4 out of 4. So to make sure you are someone who gets 4 out of 4, remember to focus on the correct lines, make 4 different points, and keep it simple. There's no need to make inferences in this section. For example, if it says that somebody sneezed, then you would write down so and so sneezed. You wouldn't write down so and so is sick, because sneezing is not necessarily a sign of sickness. So you would lose the mark there. Whereas if you just copied from the text that they'd sneezed, you'd have got that mark. So keep it simple. Try to write in a full sentence using the noun phrase that's given to you in the question. So if you're asked about a character, then you would use the character's name to start your sentences, and so on. Question 2 is worth 8 marks. You want to spend no more than 10 minutes on that question. Remember, you are being assessed in this question for your analysis of language. So this is the question where you're making inferences and you're explaining the impact of the language and the effect that it has on you as an individual. Question 3, also worth 8 marks. Again, please don't spend longer than 10 minutes on this question. And what you're looking at here are what structural choices has the writer made to make me want to read this text. Now, of course, we don't ever want to say the reader does this to make me want to read on, but we'll come to that question later. Question 4 is worth 20 marks, therefore you should be spending 25 minutes on that question. And this is one that you need to be evaluating in. So you're going to be reading what the writer has, what the student or the statement has said, deciding how far you agree with it, and then evaluating. You're weighing up the information and you're saying what is and what isn't effective. And then finally, question 5 is the creative writing question. Now here, you're going to be writing an extract from a short story or a very short story. But I'm going to spend longer talking about question 5 towards the end of this session. Now, we have told you that you can approach this paper in any order that you want. Some of you may decide to start with question 5. So you do your 45 minutes on question 5 first, then you might read the text, and then you might do questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's absolutely fine. Some of you might decide to do question 5 first, then to read it, and then do question 4. If you do it that way, that means that you've already done 75% of the paper, and you can then spend the remaining time on questions 1, 2, and 3. However, if you want to do it in the order that it comes in the booklet, that's absolutely fine as well. You've done plenty of practices in lots of different ways with your class teachers, so the choice now is up to you. Make sure you do what's best, but please manage your time so that you definitely answer question 4 and question 5, because they are worth 75% of the paper. So I'm going to change my screen now to my visualizer. So that you can see what is happening here. It may be at this point that if you do put anything in the chat, I may not notice it straight away. So we did say that you needed to have a pen and a highlighter, so that would be useful. I highly recommend using one of these 4 colour pens because it allows you to make multiple notes on the same piece of paper. So we're going to start by reading the source. Now, it's important when you're reading this source, like I said, that you do something with it. You need to make sure that you know exactly what's happening. This first bit up here is really important because it contextualizes for you the extract itself, okay? It helps you to understand what you are going to be reading. You cannot quote from this section, it's simply there to inform you. So, source A, set in 2021, the source tells us that no human being has been able to give birth for 25 years, and scientists still do not understand why. Here, Theo meets a woman as he walks through Oxford towards Magdalene College. And this is called The Children of Men. It happened on the 4th Wednesday in January. Walking to Magdalene was, as was his custom. He turned from St John Street into Beaumont Street, and he was nearing the entrance to Ashmolean Museum when a woman approached him wheeling a pram. The thin drizzle had stopped, and as she drew alongside, she paused to fold back the Mackintosh cover and push down the pram hood. The doll was revealed, propped against the cushions, the 2 hands. Sorry, I'm just letting someone in. The 2 arms, hands mittened, resting on the quilted coverlet, a parody of childhood, at once pathetic and sinister. Shocked and repelled, Theo found that he couldn't keep his eyes off it. The glossy irises, unnaturally large, bluer than those of the human eye, a gleaming azure seemed to fix on him, their unseeing stare, which yet horribly suggested a dormant intelligence, alien and monstrous. The eyelashes, dark brown, lay like spiders on the delicately tinted cheeks, and an adult abundance of yellow crimped hair sprung from beneath the close-fitting lace-trimmed bonnet. So I'm going to just reduce this down into a few keywords to help me. So I'm going to write down ordinary scene. You know, it's a city street, it's raining. And then I'm going to put here surprise at doll. Okay, so that's just going to help guide me when I'm doing question 3. It had been years since he'd last seen a doll thus paraded, but they had been common 20 years ago, had indeed become something of a craze. Doll making was the only section of the toy industry which, with the production of prams, had for a decade flourished. It had produced dolls for a whole range of frustrated maternal desire, some cheap and tawdry, but some of remarkable craftsmanship and beauty. So I'm just going to write here, reason for dolls. Now, I'm going to put a question mark, but I know from what I've read above that it's because people are no longer having babies. A middle-aged woman in a well-fitting tweeds, hair carefully groomed, came up to the pram, smiled at the doll's owner, and began a congratulatory patter. The first woman, simpering with pleasure, leaned forward, smoothed the satin-quilted cover, adjusted the bonnet, tucked in a stray of lock hair. The second tickled the doll beneath its chin as she might a cat, still murmuring her baby talk. So here I'm going to write down unnatural and unnerving scene. And then I'm also going to just jot down here, pretending, because that's what they're doing. Okay, they're pretending like things are normal. Theo, more depressed and disgusted by the charade than surely such harmless play acting justified, was turning away when it happened. So here I'm just going to write down build up to climax, because that's what that one line is signaling. And, you know, just as a structural point, you'll notice that that's separated. The second woman suddenly seized the doll, tore it from the coverings, and without a word swung it twice round her head by the legs and dashed it against the stone wall with tremendous force. The face shattered and shards of porcelain fell tinkling to the pavement. The owner, who was for 2 seconds absolutely silent, and then she screamed. The sound was horrible. The scream of the tortured, the bereaved, a terrified, high-pitched squealing, inhuman yet all too human, unstoppable. She stood there, hat askew, head thrown back to the heavens, her mouth stretched into a gape from which poured her agony, her grief, her anger. She seemed at first unaware that the attacker still stood there, watching her with silent contempt. Then the woman turned and walked briskly through the open gates, across the courtyard and into the ashmoleum. Suddenly aware that the attacker had escaped, the doll owner galloped after her, still screaming. Then, apparently realizing the hopelessness of it, returned to the pram. She'd grown quieter now, and sinking to her knees, began gathering up the broken pieces, sobbing and moaning gently, trying to match them as she might a jigsaw puzzle. Two gleaming eyes, horribly real, joined by a spring, rolled towards Theo. He had a second's impulse to pick them up, to help, to speak at least a few words of comfort. He could have pointed out that she could buy another child. So for this paragraph, I'm just going to write down shock, violence. I'm also going to write down anger, because that's certainly how the first woman felt, and then of course the second woman felt. And then I'm also going to write down despair, because for me, those are the vocabulary that highlight how that woman's feeling. So once you've read that text, and you should be able to read it more than once in 10 minutes if you wish to, you can then move on to answer the questions. So question 1 typically will focus on a very small part of the text. We're not going to look at question 1 today. We're going to move straight on to question 2. So remember, when doing this, you want to use the what, how, why method, because it's less restrictive and it will allow you to talk about everything that is happening within the text. So you're thinking here, you know, what does the writer do? What technique? What effect? Those are sort of the key areas that you want to be thinking about for the what. For the how, you're looking at providing your quotation. And you're sort of thinking, how does the writer show this? And then the key bit here is the why. Why use this word, phrase, technique? Why will it impact the reader? Okay, that's what you're thinking. What is it telling me? Remember that when it comes to this question, it is all about the effect. Now, a mistake that students often make is that they read it and they start highlighting straight away. Actually, what you need to do is you need to read the whole extract first so that you can make the best choices for you. Just because there might be a simile in there or a metaphor or alliteration that you can spot doesn't mean that that's the obvious choice for you to write about, okay? So you need to think about, what are you going to be able to say a lot about? So read it through once and then a second time before you start any highlighting. The doll was revealed. Sorry, we need to read the question. How does the writer use language to describe the doll? So everything that we do needs to come back to the description of the doll. The other thing to remember here is that it's asking us how they use language, but you need to be specific. So I don't want to see you writing the writer uses language. I want to see you say things like the writer uses adjectives, the writer uses a simile, so that you're naming what the writer is doing and the effect that they're using all in one. The doll was revealed, propped upright against the cushions, the two arms, hands mittened, rested on the quilted coverlet, a parody of childhood. At once pathetic and sinister. Shocked and repelled, Theo found that he couldn't keep his eyes off of it. The glossy irises, unnaturally large, bluer than those of any human eye, a gleaming azure, seemed to fix on him their unseeing stare, which yet horribly suggested a dormant intelligence, alien and monstrous. The eyelashes, dark brown, lay like spiders on the delicately tinted porcelain cheeks, and an adult abundance of yellow crimped hair sprung from beneath the close-fitting lace-trimmed bonnet. So what we want to be looking at here is exactly how the writer is using the language. So we're going to look back at it now. So it tells us that the doll was revealed. Propped against the cushions, two arms, hands mitten, rested on the quilting coverlet. A parody of childhood would be something that I think I would be able to write about. And parody here suggests mockery, not a real child in some respects. At once pathetic and sinister. So now I've got a pair of adjectives. And that pair of adjectives, again, is something I think I'd be able to write about. It almost creates this inhuman idea, maybe even a flash of horror. Shocked and repelled. Now that's about Theo. So that's probably going to be slightly harder to write about. So I'm going to skip over that. Theo found that he couldn't keep his eyes off of it. The glossy irises, unnaturally large, bluer than those of any human eye, a gleaming azure, seemed to fix on them their unseeing stare, which yet horribly suggested a dormant intelligence, alien and monstrous. The eyelashes, dark brown, lay like spiders on the delicately tinted porcelain cheeks, and an adult abundance of yellow crimped hair sprung from beneath the close-fitting lace-trimmed bonnet. Now you'll see here, I've highlighted a real range of information. I'm not going to be able to write about all of that. So I want to make the choices that are going to allow me to have plenty to say. So if I look here now, I can see that we've got a range of adjectives being used. Now, not all of these adjectives are going to allow me to write as succinctly and as cohesively as I want. So I'll need to think about the adjectives that I want to use. So for me, it's things like glossy, unnaturally, alien and monstrous. Those are the adjectives that are going to allow me to really delve in and explain myself. Also, got this simile here, which to me reminds me of like a horror film. And when it talks about yellow crimped hair, well, that just sounds fake, makes me feel uncomfortable. Now, I'm not going to be able to write about all of this, so I want to be able to narrow it down and think about what I'm going to write. So for me, I think I would definitely want to write about the use of adjectives. And I would definitely want to talk about the simile. And I think also, actually, I probably want to include something here about the use of the verb stare. Because for me, those are the things that really stand out. Now, I'm not going to take up a lot of time now having a go at writing out a full answer. I'm just going to show you how I might start. I would suggest that you copy down this model as I go, listening to what I'm telling you, and then have a go in your own time at finishing this off, perhaps using this plan of mine, and if not, using another couple of ideas of your own. Now, the writer of this source is a woman called P.D. James. So, in the interest of making sure we're writing as maturely and as critically as possible, we'll be using the writer's surname. So, I'm going to start by saying James employs a range of increasingly unsettling adjectives to present the doll as something inhuman and grotesque. Remember, Theo is shocked and appalled by what he sees, so saying that it's grotesque is fine. And if I just stop to explain how I've done this. So what does the writer do? Well, James employs a range of increasingly unsettling adjectives. What technique is being used? Unsettling adjectives. Why are they doing that? To present the doll as something human and grotesque. So I've got my what's here. What does the writer do? What technique? What are they doing that for? Okay. Then I want to introduce this. So I'm going to say, she describes the doll's eyes as being, and I'm just going to quote the bits that I want to use, as glossy and unnaturally large. Fixed in an unseeing stare. Whilst also stating that the doll is alien and monstrous. Now, what I hope you've noticed, and perhaps you've seen the video before where I talk about cumulative effect, but what I hope you notice here is that I've cherry picked the adjectives that I think I'm going to be able to have a lot to say about. So I'm starting with glossy and unnatural, then I'm moving on to unseeing, and then I've got alien and monstrous. Now, I've said that she uses a range of increasingly unsettling adjectives, so I've used 5 short embedded quotations. And now I want to go back and explain the effect. So I've done my whats, I've done my hows, now I need to do my whys. And in my whys, I'm zooming in on key ideas, I'm exploring the impact of them, okay? And it's that impact. Why has the writer chosen these words that is absolutely imperative when doing this? So I'm going to start by saying at the start of this section, I'm just going to mention the technique again. The adjectives glossy and unnaturally large have connotations of, and when I think of something being glossy, I think about it being, really shiny. And for me, this idea that they're glossy and unnaturally large, it makes it sound like they're false, okay? So have connotations of falseness, which makes the reader feel uncomfortable and unsettled, as these are not the adjectives one would usually employ to describe a baby or a harmless toy. Okay, so I've done some of my why. Now I could leave it there, but let's not forget I've also used unseeing, stare, alien, and monstrous. So actually I need to write a little bit more to really hammer home what I'm saying. Furthermore, the unseeing adjective creates a feeling of horror for the reader, as it once again suggests that the doll is somehow sinister. And highlights that it is a parody of childhood. Now, again, I don't really just want to stop there, because I also want to talk about the idea of the alien and monstrous. So I'm going to just finish that off. I'm going to say, finally, James's decision to use the adjectives alien and monstrous further compound for the reader that this doll is something from a horror film, alien connotes something that doesn't belong, whilst monstrous suggests both a cruel and ugly being. Again, this is not what we expect a child or a doll to be described as, and therefore James succeeds in presenting the doll as a horrific and sinister parody of childhood, which unsettles the reader. There we go. So you can see from that model that I've done that I've gone really to town with it in terms of analysing the language, and I've just focused on that set of adjectives. Now, you'll obviously be able to write a little bit quicker than that in the exam, and so you should be able to go on and explain at least another element of it, perhaps that simile, or perhaps the use of the verb stare, okay? So what you want to make sure is that you're always delving into it really deeply, and you're pulling apart the language. Remember, it is all about the effect. So that final section, the why use that word, why use that phrase, why that technique, why will it have an impact on the reader? That's the most important part, okay, that you can include. So that's really, really important that you include that. Okay, so let's talk about structure. Now, I know that the structure question for many is something that you find difficult, and it is an unusual text. So it's an unusual question in some respects. Remember, it tells you how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader. And again, I want you to think about this what, how, why. So for the what, it's what does the writer do? How do they do it? So that's your reference. And then why? And really what you're thinking is, why does this interest the reader? Okay, and that's what you're thinking. What does the writer do? How does the writer do it? Why does it interest me as a reader? Does it change something? Does it add something? Does it shift my understanding? Does it develop my understanding? Is it reinforcing? Is it introducing? Does it build? Does it reveal? There are lots and lots and lots of different things to think about here, okay? But you absolutely want to be thinking about what the writer is doing and why they are doing it. Why have they decided to start it in that way? So I've come up with a list of sentence starters that you might find useful when looking at paper 1, question 3. So for example, you could start your paragraph by saying structurally, so that you're automatically placing yourself in the mindset to write about structure, but you're also signposting to the examiner that you're going to be talking about structure. Then, when you're focusing on a bit of the structure, you might say this allows the reader to identify with X. In the case of this extract, it might be Theo, it might be the woman, making them feel. So how does it make them feel? You need to go and explain that. Do not underestimate the power of because. If you're writing something, if I could say so what at the end of it, you've not added a because. You might say, as a result of X, the reader feels, learns, considers. You might say X creates a sense of. X allows the reader to think, feel, visualize, imagine. X draws the reader's attention to Y and elicits emotions of. Overall, in this extract, the writer draws or sets X to develop a sense of Y. Now, I'm not saying that this is an exhaustive list of sentence structures, but it's definitely something that could help you, okay? So I'm going to show you how to use some of these as we go through a model for this question. So before we start this question, we need to go back to the text. And we're being asked here, how does the writer structure this text to interest me as a reader? So I'm going to do my highlighting for structure in blue, and then that will give me another colour when I need to do my question 4. So before I reread the whole thing, if I even want to, I'm just going to remind myself of these annotations. So it starts off here by saying that it's an ordinary scene. And so that might be the 4th Wednesday in January. If it's creating an ordinary scene for me, what is it doing? It's placing me there, okay? I am the reader, so it's placing me there. And it seems really ordinary, doesn't it, as it introduces that doll. Then it tells me that Theo couldn't keep his eyes off of it. So the fact that it's telling me that again, it links to this idea that he's surprised that it's a doll. But what it's also doing is it's aligning me with Theo. It's making me feel like he is feeling. So that's sort of my first thing that I could talk about. We then, and we'll know this because we've just looked at it, have this section where the focus is on the doll. So here we have a switch of focus and a zoom in on the doll. So I'd want to talk about that. That's an important idea that they have done there. They've included that for a reason. I then here almost get sort of like two instances. I get told the reason for the dolls. So this is like, again, a switch of focus. It's an explanation. And then I get another character coming in. And I've said here that it's an unnatural and an unnerving scene. So this, for example, could be maybe the third thing that I talked about if I've got time. I could talk about the use of this separated paragraph and how it has that build up to the climax. Or I might talk about how in the final section, we've got that real sense of climax being presented to us. But either way, you can see that I've got 4 or more structural features that I could write about. And what I want to do is I want to think about what could I personally say the most about. Now, I think that when it comes to this question, it's a good idea to do some like general overviews as well. So let's have a look at what we could be writing. Thanks. So I want to make as many points as I possibly can. And I don't want to spend more than 10 minutes on this, okay? So I want to start by showing that I'm engaging with this idea of structure. So I'm going to start by saying structurally, James has organised this extract to align the reader with, and remember the protagonist is called Theo, with Theo's experience. So that's like a very general point that I've made, okay? But in that very general point, I would pick up a mark because I've made a clear idea here, haven't I? Structurally, James organised this extract to align the reader with Theo's experience. So then I'm going to say at the beginning or at the start of the extract, James establishes a mundane setting. And then I'm going to show how that mundane setting has been established because she says it is the 4th Wednesday in January. Now, remember, this is not a language analysis question, so I don't want to analyse language. What I want to do is explain why this choice has an impact on me as the reader. So what has this got to do with how I feel? So I might say, which provides the reader, which almost provides the reader with a false sense of security. as it introduces a scene of normality, which the reader might recognise. However, when James reveals the doll to the reader, so if I think about those sentence structures that I was going to use, I've got X creates a sense of. So here, when James reveals the doll to the reader, it creates a sense of, and I'm going to say here apprehension, as it is not was expected. So you can see here that I'm signposting the structural elements. So I've said structurally, James has organised the extract to align the reader with Theo's experience. At the start of the extract, James establishes all of those are structural devices that I'm discussing. And then we've got here, which almost provides the reader with a false sense of security as it introduces a scene of normality, which the reader might recognise. However, when James reveals the doll to the reader, it creates a sense of apprehension as it's not what was expected, almost provides false sense of security, introduces. You can see here that this is very much focused on the structure and the impact that it's having on us as a reader. Okay, so again, you'd want to be able to do 2 more of those. I might suggest perhaps picking up the fact that James then zooms in on the description of the doll. I might say that he uses grotesque imagery and how that creates a sense of unease for the reader, which allows the reader to identify with Theo. That would be the next moment that I might then go on to, because we're talking about that surprise at it. Okay, so what you're thinking about is how you can layer up those elements. So the next question is question 4. Now, you'll remember from question 4 that you're going to have been given a completely made up statement, okay? A student having read this section of the text said, this part of the story really captures the shock of the mother and the horror of the situation. And so remember, we're always going to have almost 2 parts to this presented. So this part of the story really captures the shock of the mother and the horror of the situation. And what you want to do is you want to think about how you can boil that down into a smaller bit. So, you know, what you're going to think about is here, you know, do you agree or do you disagree? So before we can decide that, let's read it. So we're going to read the lines 21 to the end, and we're looking at whether or not it captures the shock of the mother and the horror of the situation. So for this instance, we are only looking at this final bit. So my suggestion would be to draw a box around it in a different colour so you're not tempted to talk about anything else. The second woman suddenly seized the doll and tore it from the coverings, and without a word swung it twice round her head by the legs and dashed it against the stone wall with tremendous force. The face shattered and shards of porcelain fell tinkling to the pavement. The owner was, for 2 seconds, absolutely silent. And then she screamed. The sound was horrible. The scream of the tortured, the bereaved, a high, terrified, pitching, squealing, inhuman, yet all too human, unstoppable. She stood there, hat askew, head thrown back to the heavens, her mouth stretched into a gape from which poured her agony, her grief, her anger. She seemed at first unaware that the attacker still stood there, watching her with silent contempt. Then the woman turned and walked briskly through the open gates, across the courtyard and into the ashmoleum. Suddenly aware that the attacker had escaped, the doll owner galloped after her, still screaming. Then, apparently realizing the hopelessness of it, returned to the pram. She'd grown quieter now, and sinking to her knees, began gathering up the broken pieces, sobbing and moaning gently, trying to match them as she might a jigsaw puzzle. Two gleaming eyes, horribly real, joined by a spring, rolled toward Theo. He had a second's impulse to pick them up, to help, to speak at least a few words and comfort. He could have pointed out that she could buy another child. So let's return to this question. Does it capture the shock of the mother and the horror of the situation? So I'm going to say yes, it does capture shock and shocks me. And I do think that it creates a clear idea of the horror of the situation. Now, when it comes to this question, again, you've got to think about the what and the how and the why. Okay, so what and how is more important, not more important, but the what and the how is really important. Okay, you've got to be saying, what do they do? How do they do it? And then the why here is the evaluation. So the what and the how are not more important, as I almost foolishly said, but your why is the evaluation. You've got to be explaining that. Now, the bullet points here: consider your own impressions of the women, evaluate how the writer creates a shock of horror, and support your opinions with quotations from the text. These are really important ideas, okay? And these are what you want to be integrating into your answer. So you'll notice at the bottom of the page here, you've almost got like an essay plan. And this is very much how I want you to consider this question. So you want to start off by providing an introduction that essentially just answers the question in a really brief way. So I might write, I wholeheartedly agree with the statement in this extract. Now, this would effectively be what you'd write in your answer. In this extract, James successfully conveys the horror of the situation whilst also capturing the mother's shock. So that's almost like a thesis statement. You remember these from your English literature. I wholeheartedly agree with the statement. In this extract, James successfully conveys the horror of the situation whilst also capturing the mother's shock. By saying that you wholeheartedly agree and that James successfully does something, you are ultimately starting that evaluative process. So let's go back to here. And what we want to do is we want to find a couple of bits of evidence to support either. So remember, we are looking at capturing the shock and also the horror of the situation. So if we're thinking about this, we're going to be as clear as we possibly can. So the horror of the situation. So look here, it starts by saying the second woman suddenly seized the doll, tore it from the coverings without a word, swung it twice round her head by the legs, dashed it against the stone wall with tremendous force. The face shattered, shards of porcelain fell tinkling to the pavement. The owner was for 2 seconds absolutely silent, and then we've got, and then she screamed. The sound was horrible. The scream of the tortured, the bereaved, a terrified, high-pitched, squealing, inhuman yell, all too human yet unstoppable. So straight away, I've got a series of bits of quotation here that would support the idea of the violence. And I've got something here that would also talk about the way that the mother is feeling. So let's keep going. She stood there, hat askew, head thrown back to the heavens, her mouth stretched into a gape from which produced her agony, her grief, her anger. She seemed at first unaware that the attacker still stood there, watching her with silent contempt. Then the woman turned and walked briskly through the open gates and across the courtyard into the ashmoleum. Suddenly aware the attacker had escaped, the doll owner glumped after her, still screaming. Then, apparently realising the hopelessness of it, returned to the pram. She'd grown quieter now, sinking to her knees, broken pieces, sobbing and moaning gently, trying to match them as she might a jigsaw puzzle. Two gleaming eyes, horribly real, joined by a spring, rolled toward Theo. He had a second's impulse to pick them up, to help, to speak at least a few words of comfort. He could have pointed out that she could buy another child. Now, there are some bits of humour here, such as he could have pointed out that she could buy another child, and that might be something relevant to include in your response. But for me, I'm saying I wholeheartedly agree, so I'm going to choose not to include those. So let's look at what my plan for this question might look like. So that's what my answer would be. So it captures the shock of the mother and the horror of the situation. So my first point here, I'm going to talk about the horror of the situation. And if I'm thinking about the horror of the situation, I'm going to look at the way that verbs are being used, because she seized the doll, tore, swung, dashed. Okay, so these to me all talk about the horror of the situation. And remember, I'm evaluating. So I want to be using words like successfully, without a doubt. I also want to make sure that I'm talking about the violence, but also the fact that it's a shock. It comes out of nowhere. My second idea, I'm going to talk about the other part of the text. I'm going to talk about the mother's shock. And, I'm thinking here, well, perhaps I could include that bit where it says the owner was for 2 seconds absolutely silent, but I'm not. I'm going to go for she screamed. And then we've got that use of the list: tortured, bereaved, terrified. So again, I want to be talking here about how she successfully creates that sensation. Okay. And then I want to perhaps talk again about the final sort of section, the hopelessness of it, the fact that she's still screaming. So here, for my third idea, I'm going to again talk about the mother's shock subsiding and the impact. And again, the quotations that I'm going to be using might be still screaming, sinking to her knees. And I might talk about how that's the sort of the use of adrenaline rubbing off. And then conclusion, I'm just going to summarize what I've said above, as in the whole thing. So let's think about how that might look as a short response. So again, just going to go over this bit here. Okay, so I've started by saying I wholeheartedly agree with the statement. In this extract, James successfully conveys the horror of the situation whilst also capturing the mother's shock. So I'm still going to use that kind of what, how, why. So what's being used, what technique, how's it done, but I'm going to also be evaluating as I go. So I'm going to start by saying, without a doubt, that's an evaluation. Without a doubt, James successfully captures the horror of the situation through her use of violent verbs which highlight the rage and fury of the second woman, which shocks the reader. We might say here, James states that the woman sees the doll, that she tore it from the pram, swung it by the legs, before she dashed it against the wall. So you can see here that I've got my what on my hand. So without a doubt, but this is evaluating. So just highlight that. So without a doubt, James successfully captures the horror of the situation through her use of violent verbs which highlight the rage and fury of the second woman, which shocks the reader. James states that the woman sees the doll, that she tore it from the pram, swung it by the legs before she dashed it against the wall. Now I need to evaluate this use of vocabulary. I'm not going to spend ages analysing it, I am evaluating. So what is it about those word choices that make it successful? So I might say something like here, so look here, we've got seized, tore, swung, dashed. So I might say here, the harsh consonants within the violent verbs successfully convey not only a sense of horror for the reader, but also creates an atmosphere of violence and rage, which makes the situation even more shocking. Okay, so let's look again at how I've built up that evaluation. So here, the harsh consonants within the violent verbs successfully convey not only a sense of horror for the reader, but also creates an atmosphere of violence and rage, which makes the situation even more shocking. So here, even more, that's evaluating. Anytime you say something is successfully, anytime that you say without a doubt, anytime you say something like highlights, okay? So you're thinking about how you're continually building these ideas up. but most importantly, you are evaluating, and that's what you absolutely must be doing. Okay, so when you've got some time later on as part of revision, have a go at writing that response, but remember to keep evaluating, okay? That's what you really want to be making sure you're doing. So finally, let's have a very quick look at the creative writing section. Now, one of the key things to remind you here is that when you are the reader, you are the person who is being manipulated by the author, okay? So the author is the person who is manipulating you. So the author manipulates you. You are this person. Okay, so when you are reading section A, this is you, okay? But when you're in section B, this is you, and this is the examiner. You become the person who has to manipulate the examiner. You become the person who wants to make me feel something. So in question 2, when we're saying, well, what language are they using? What impact does it have on me? You're thinking, right, what language will I use? How will it have an impact on the examiner? When you're thinking about structure, how has the writer structured this to make me want to be engaged and interested? You're now thinking, what do I need to do to make my reader, to make the examiner engaged? And that's really important. So you'll get a choice of 2 tasks when you get in there. Either write a description as suggested by this image or write the opening of a story that begins in the snow. The image will be so vague that anything, absolutely anything, could be suggested by this image. So, yep, you can see a street in the snow. That means you can write a story on the street or a description of a street. Could be a street at night. Could be just about snow. Okay, it's really varied. And that's why going into this exam with ideas already put together can really help you. Have a description of weather that you could use for your description or your narrative, okay? Have characters that you know really well so you can think about how they would relate. I'm going to go through my 5 top tips in a minute, which is going to expand on those a little bit more. But one thing that's super important is that you structure your text, because a well-structured text, just like we've seen in the example, will keep you reading on. Now, the other thing I want you to think about is you have only got 45 minutes to write something. 45 minutes is not enough time to write a full story. 45 minutes is not enough time to write a Bollywood blockbuster. It's not enough time to write a Hollywood action film. It's not enough time to write a Netflix drama. Okay, 45 minutes is enough time to write about one event, one short scene. Think about all the extracts that we've looked at. Think about the extract we've just looked at. They happen in very short spaces of time. Let's think about this extract. It's an ordinary January. There's a woman walking. A doll appears. The other woman attacks it. This is, at tops, a 10-minute event. Okay, at 10 minutes, absolutely no longer than that would that take place. Okay, so think about the other text that you could be writing about. Think about the fact that when we did the Mr. Fisher extract, that was a 10-minute episode where he's marking some books. Think about the Rosabelle extract when she gets on the bus on the way home from school. 15-20 minutes at the tops. Think about the extract with Hartop and Alice when he throws her out and she goes back to get the flowers. 25-30 minutes at the most. Okay, think about the one where the woman is washing the dishes and she thinks she sees a ghost in her garden. 15 minutes tops. So you want to keep your time frame really focused so that you too can write something. You're not going to be able to write a whole story. Think about it as being an activity where you're doing something very similar to the extract that you've just read. So it's really important that when you do this, that you remember to drop your reader in. And the easiest thing to do with drop is always to set the scene. And when you're setting the scene, there's nothing better than using the weather. Okay, remember the Jamaica Inn extract uses the weather. Okay, the Hartop scene used the weather. Lots of extracts use the weather. So when you're thinking about that, what is it that you're going to be able to mention? Well, if you're talking about the snow, you talk about the snow. If you're talking about wind and rain, you talk about the wind and rain. Okay, but what you do want to do is that you want to make sure that you are using sophisticated vocab and that you are being engaging and that you are being contextually relevant. If you are, for example, writing about a storm, it is very unlikely that in the storm there will be birds tweeting and chirping. It's not going to happen. Okay, in a storm, if you're intent on having birds, then there might be a crow gripping onto a branch, squawking. There might be a kestrel screaming in the wind. Okay, be contextually relevant. If you're talking about snow and you're creating a nice, peaceful scene, then you might have a dove cooing. Okay, think about what you're doing. Be contextually relevant. The next thing you want to do is shift your focus. Think about that extract that we've just looked at. The shift went from the weather or the ordinary day to switching to another character. So here, it's a good place to intro a character. Again, sophisticated vocab, engaging, contextually relevant. Think about which of the characters you want to use. What are they doing? Are they walking? If I'm using this image, I'm going for this character, she's walking, she's crossing the road. She's got a lot on her mind because she's going to a funeral. So she's feeling somber, or maybe she's reminiscing about good times. Okay, then I'm going to zoom in on a detail. Now, that detail could be zooming in on this character's thoughts. It could be zooming in on something on this image. Here, I'm going to zoom in on this character in the distance. And, you know, does she know this person? Is she wondering about them, whether or not they're going through the same? So, you know, that's what I need to think about. Are they going to catch up and talk to each other? Maybe she thinks that it's a case of mistaken identity. And then finally, I want to zoom out and leave the scene. So perhaps she calls the name and this person doesn't turn around, and therefore she comes back to her senses. But as I zoom out, I want to try and be cyclical. So I'm going to come back to the weather. And then I'm going to leave the scene. Now, you can spend up to 5 minutes planning this. You can be a lot more detailed than I've been. But what this will allow me to do now is I know what I'm going to write about. So I'm going to start by writing the weather. I've already, as part of my revision, planned how I would describe the weather in any number of situations. Okay. And I'm doing something suggested by this image, so I can easily take any of those weather types. Okay. So I already know what I'm going to do there. I already know my character really well. Okay, this is a character who is self-absorbed. She's going to a funeral. She's reminiscing about the relationship she had with that character. And then she sees another character in the distance. And actually, she thinks that this is the person at the funeral that she's going to. So she zooms in. She's going to talk about the hair of the individual, the way that they're walking, you know, what's going to make them think it's that wrong person. And then she's going to call out. But that person doesn't turn around. So she realizes her error. which will allow me to zoom out, and then I'm going to come back to that weather description, okay? See, 10 minutes, a really short period of time. So just to finish up, ladies and gentlemen, let's think about paper 1, question 5. And these are sort of my top tips for making sure that you do well. You want to clearly structure your piece of writing. So focus on a small window of time. Think about the extract that you will have just read and the hundreds of extracts that you've done as part of your revision in class, okay? So you want to really have a very concentrated, a very focused piece of time. When using your vocabulary, make sure that it is varied, sophisticated, and contextually relevant. Make sure you know the vocab that you're using is something people are going to know. You don't want to use something really obscure and weird for people not to understand, okay? That's going to make it difficult. My third tip here is use structure for effect. Think back to the Children of Men extract that we've looked at that one sentence paragraph that's being used to create tension. Can you do something like that in yours? Use a range of punctuation. Think about those preloaded sentences that we've talked about before, those sentences where you already know where to use a colon because you've practiced it, or those sentences where you already know where to use a semicolon because you've practiced it. Can you use a hyphen somewhere? Can you use parenthetic commas? Okay, use these to create that range of punctuation, because punctuation gets rewarded twice. It gets rewarded in accuracy of punctuation, plus it gets rewarded in effective sentences. Vocab is also something that's awarded twice. It's mentioned twice in the marks scheme. And then finally, try to be original. Take inspiration from things that have been successful, but don't copy anything, okay? Being original is going to allow you to be as successful as possible. So then, guys, I hope that this session has been really useful for you. I wish you all lots of luck for tomorrow, and just remember to spend the rest of today doing the revision that you need to do. I would strongly advise that you spend some time completing the questions in the paper that I've gone through today so that you've had that real range of experience. And this recording will be on YouTube very shortly so that you can refer to it if you want. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning, and good luck with the rest of your day studying. Take care. Goodbye.